Thank you again, Rabbi Shapiro, for sitting with me today. The first discussion we had focused on Zionism turning religion into a nationality. I'm hoping today we can maybe look at the psychological dimension of Zionism and this very interesting concept you have of overcompensation and whether this overcompensation would have occurred if it weren't for European anti-Semitism. So perhaps we can start the discussion with you just explaining what this overcompensation is and how it manifests itself.
We'll continue from our conversation last
Sure.
time. The Zionists created Zionism in order to solve a problem. People think the problem was anti-Semitism, but as I explain in my book, that really isn't correct. Anti-Semitism to the Zionists, in the words of Max Nordau at the First Zionist Congress in his speech, anti-Semitism just showed the Jews that they need to correct something in themselves. Anti-Semitism was a symptom of something that the Jews need to change. In other words, the Zionists looked at the Jews in a similar way to the anti-Semites, weak, ugly, disgusting. Jabotinsky, who we're going to speak about more shortly since he's so relevant to today's Israel, said, and I quote, "I know that I'm a Zionist because the Jewish people are a very nasty people. Their neighbors hate them and they're right. Their end will be a Bartholomew night." That's a quote. What they wanted to do was change the Jewish people. They diagnosed what they called the Jewish problem, and anti-Semitism was a symptom of it. Mm-hmm. They said that the Jews have to change. But what has to change in the Jews? Well, the anti-Semites accused the Jews, they looked at them as being ugly, weak, unmanly. That was a word they used a lot. Substandard human being, people who aren't interested in things that normal human beings are interested, such as sports, such as art, such as people who sit in the ghetto just poring over musty tomes of the Talmud. And the truth is that, yes, that's exactly what we were doing. We look at it with pride because we're having spiritual accomplishments. Imagine, if you will, by way of analogy, a group of Shaolin monks or something, the way they dress, the way they look, the way they act, in comparison to a regular, emancipated, enlightened so-called society, right? You could see people looking at them as weirdos, people who aren't interested in society, people who are purposeless, right? Mm-hmm. The unmanly, weak, that you can't accuse them of, because they're busy with the martial arts a whole day. But we were busy with fulfilling our religion a whole day, with studying our Torah a whole day. And the Zionists said, enough is enough. First, they tried assimilating. They said, we're not going to be Jewish. We're just going to be regular, non-Jewish people. But that plan didn't work because the anti-Semites persecuted them as well. 1881 Russian pogroms targeted non-religious Jews, assimilated Jews, as much as it did religious Jews. So they figured, we're not assimilated enough. We have to change the entire idea of what a Jew is in the eyes of the Jews and in the eyes of the world, not on an individual basis, on a national basis. Mm-hmm. So they decided they're going to change the personality of the Jew. They're going to change the definition of a Jew. I mean, they tried to be non-Jews, that didn't work. So now they're stuck being Jews. See, that's the point. They're stuck being Jews. But they suffered from this shame. They suffered from this trauma, which was a result of anti-Semitism, which was a result of their inability to make it in the non-Jewish world. It was a result of their inability to be accepted amongst the family of nations. So they decided that they're going to transform the Jews. They're going to convince the Jews to look at themselves as a nationality. That's what we spoke about last time. But now the question is, what type of nationality? There are all sorts of types of nationality, and every nationality has its own culture and its own personality and its own characteristics. The trauma, and that's an important word, the trauma and shame that the Zionists had were the most important contributing factors to what they want it to be. So I'm going to read you something from Vladimir Jabotinsky's eulogy that he held for Theodor Herzl upon Herzl's death. Now, he referred to the Jews as, or what he was going to call them, Hebrews. Now, Hebrew, in the Bible, by the way, is very interesting that the word Hebrew is used for the Jews only when non-Jewish people are involved. Okay. So Pharaoh refers to Hashem as the God of the Hebrews. Jonah, when he meets the non-Jews, he says, I'm a Hebrew. The God never refers to Jews as Hebrews, with one exception, a Hebrew slave. And our commentators say that exception is made because the Hebrew slave, it's a derogatory position. The fact that he put himself in a position of slavery, it's a degrading thing to be. But Jew means it's a religious identification. Hebrew is more of like the language, kind of like Semite, which is the way non-Jews identify Jews. Vladimir Jabotinsky said we're going to change the Jews into Hebrews, which we would call today a Zionist. And he's explaining what a Hebrew is. He's saying that Theodor Herzl exemplified this Hebrew personality. Quote, to imagine what a Hebrew is, to picture his image in our minds, we have no example from which to draw. Instead, we must use the method of Ipcha Mistavra. It's a rabbinic expression that means we're going to learn what it is from its opposite. We take as our starting point the Zhid of today. Zhid was a derogatory Russian term for Jew, kind of like. We're going to take as our starting point the Zhid of today and to imagine in our minds his exact opposite. Let us erase from that picture all the personality traits that are so typical of a Zhid, and let us insert into it all the desirable traits whose absence are so typical in him. Because the Zhid, meaning the Jew, is ugly, sickly, and lacks handsomeness, we will endow the ideal image of the Hebrew with masculine beauty, stature, massive shoulders, vigorous movements, bright colors, and shades of color. The Jew, the Zhid, is frightened and downtrodden. The Hebrew ought to be proud and independent. The Zhid is disgusting to all. The Hebrew should charm all. The Zhid has accepted submission. The Hebrew ought to know how to command. The Zhid likes to hide with bated breath from the eyes of strangers. The Hebrew, with brazenness and greatness, should march ahead to the entire world, look them straight and deep in their eyes, and hoist before them the banner, I am a Hebrew. Now that word, I am a Hebrew, is what Jonah told the non-Jews. In other words, they were looking to create a people, personality of which is an overcorrection, an overcompensation for all the perceived weaknesses, ugliness, degenerate characteristics of a Jew. They were looking for something to be the exact opposite of a Jew. Of all the things that the Zionists hated in the Jews was the fact that the Jews are not warriors. In fact, they're the opposite. As you know, you read my book, that in our tradition, in our ideology, in our religion, there are two brothers. There's Jacob and his brother Esau. Esau was a hunter. Jacob was a man that learned Torah all day in the study halls. The Jew is supposed to be, well, as our sages tell us, who is strong? He who conquers himself, he who conquers his urges. We have no interest in wars. We have no interest in fighting. We're not interested in that at all. In the Bible, there are wars all over the place, but we understand and interpret the Bible, those wars, in a completely different way. We believe that the righteous people won wars because of their righteousness. The battle does not go to the strong, as the Torah says. The battle goes to the righteous. We believe that King David was not, picture King David not as, I don't know, Ragnar Lothbrok with a yarmulke on his head and a spear in his hand going into battle, but rather as a saintly rabbi who won wars the same way Moses did. You split the Red Sea, the God drowns the Egyptians, and so on and so forth. The way Elisha the prophet did by having an army of angels in the book of 2 Kings fight against the enemy army. We believe that it was the holy rabbis that won wars. And because there are so many wars in the Bible, some rabbis said that this is why the Orthodox Jewish tradition doesn't emphasize studying of the Bible itself without the accompanying oral Torah. The Bible itself without our Talmudic traditions would conceivably give a person the impression, and other religions have this impression of the Bible, that it glorifies war, or that it's the opposite. In Orthodox Judaism, it's the exact opposite. In Orthodox Judaism, we'd rather run than fight. In the martial arts, they tell you the first thing is to avoid a fight. We avoid a fight no matter what. And this the Zionists looked at as cowardly. We don't consider it cowardly. We consider attackers anti-Semites. Imagine a person surrounded by lions, tigers, and bears, stuck in his house, and they're besieging him. Can you imagine a human being saying, all right, let's go out and fight. At least we'll go down fighting. At least we'll take some of these animals with us. That doesn't make any sense. And yet, in the world, in the human condition, that's considered a noble thing to do. If we're going to die anyway, instead of just waiting here, let's take some of them with us. Let's go down fighting. That idea of going down fighting, no. A human being that wants to kill people is an animal, is worse than an animal. Because an animal, it's not his fault he's an animal. But these are worse. There is no shame in being attacked by an animal, and there is no shame in being attacked by an evil person. You only feel shame if you assume there's some type of competition between you and the attacker. You're the loser, he's the winner. Well, winning and losing to us, well, that's not the form that we play. Winning and losing only applies to spiritual attainments and the person's goodness and things like that. But we weren't interested in this. It wasn't it wasn't an accomplishment to be a fearsome warrior. We don't have towns that are holy towns, or we don't even care about places of battles, such as the Alamo, for example. In Judaism, there's no such thing. And the Bible, like I said, is full of wars, but the places of those wars don't interest us. The Zionists changed this. They made Masada. Masada was a place of, they were actually not courageous at all. They all killed themselves up in Masada. They didn't fight. We know there were a couple of survivors that hid themselves amongst the bodies that told the story, and Josephus recorded it. But the Jews never had such stories of wars and glorifying military might or anything like that. The story of Hanukkah, I'll give you an example of the difference between Judaism and Zionism. The story of Hanukkah, we know, the Syrian Greeks wanted to force us to give up our religion. The Jews took up arms with the intent to die for the religion. They said, we're going to die for our religion. We will not give it up. God made a miracle. This is our tradition. And instead of dying for the religion, they won the war. It's not that, our history is not that, okay, we tried to win, or they tried to win, but they knew they were going to lose. The miracle was that they won, rather than dying. Then they went back to the temple, and they only had 1 day's worth of oil. The oil lasted for 8 days, and that's our Hanukkah story. Mm-hmm. The Talmud, when it records the reason why we have a Hanukkah holiday, it doesn't mention the war at all. Mm-hmm. It says only because of the miracle of the oil, not the miracle of winning the war. Mm-hmm. Because that's not important to us. There are some opinions that the reason why we have 8 days of Hanukkah and not 1, because if there was 1 day of oil, then that day wasn't a miracle. So we should only have 7 days of Hanukkah, because that 1 day is to commemorate the miracle of the war. But most of our commentators say, no, that's not an acceptable explanation. But our Talmud leaves out the war altogether. The Zionists, not only do they emphasize the war, but there was a famous Hanukkah song written by somebody who later became the Israeli army's chief education officer. And the chorus, the only line that's repeated twice is, I'll say it in English, there was no miracle, there was no oil, nothing was found. We did it all ourselves. We erased from our Talmud, our Talmud ignored the miracle of the war. The Zionists denied the miracle of the oil and said the whole thing was their own doing in the war. That's the difference between Judaism and Zionism. The Zionists wanted to overcompensate for this Jewish weakness. So they created, and in order to save time, I'm not going to go into all the different Zionist ideologies. There were the right wing, the left wing. I'm going to stick to the right wing because they're the ones that are relevant today in Israel. The Jabotinskyites. So Jabotinsky he was very fascist influenced, and he had basically 2 areas of influence. He had his revisionist Zionism, that was a political party, which later morphed into the Cherus party, which is today's Likud. But he also had his Beitar youth. Mm-hmm. He was always very fascist influenced and very militant and right wing. But for the Beitar youth, he wanted to train them to be, not even sure what the word is, militant is an understatement. They sung songs about creating a new race. But the songs had a lot to do with blood, fire, revenge, and things like that. Bedamu bayeza, with blood and sweat, yukam lanu geza, there will arise for us a race. Gaon v'nediv v'achzar, proud and generous to each other, and achzar, and cruel. To die or conquer the mountain. That was the youths were running around singing things like this. The Shir HaBaryonim, the bullies or the thugs. The word Biryonim means something around there. Bullies, thugs. The song of the Biryonim. We're going to conquer our land. This is the 1920s. We're not talking after World War II. It's the 1920s. They were singing, we're going to conquer our land in the storm of war. We're going to demand our inheritance with a strong hand. And the chorus goes, in blood and fire, Judah fell. In blood and fire, Judah will arise again. Now, our tradition tells us that it's a distortion of a prayer that we say, that in fire, Judah will be rebuilt. It means that the third temple will come down from heaven. God will send it, a fiery temple coming down. But he added blood. Blood and fire means with war. We're going to use blood and fire to redeem Judah. Things like we're going to fight for our freedom, and if freedom dies, then revenge will live. If there's no justice in the land, the sword will judge. Things like this. And there are kids, teenagers singing this. Blood, fire, revenge, a new race. And he taught them to die or conquer the mountain. That was their theme. Mm-hmm. And what they tried to do, the Zionists, each one in his own way, to use the shame and the trauma that the Zionists went through of being shamed and traumatized by the non-Jews, and channeling that into becoming something just the opposite, something that nobody would ever say is weak. Nobody would ever, you think we're weak? We're going to show you what weak is. They're going to be just the opposite. You think we're cowardly? No, we're going to be just the opposite. That's what he said. Ibchem istavru. We're going to create people that are the opposite of Jews. People who are going to show those anti-Semites. We're going to show the whole world. We'll show ourselves what we really are, to create the opposite personality of a Jew. And so but they were forced to be Jews. You see, now they took biblical themes. This was here, let me read you something. In order to claim Palestine, therefore, Zionists do, now why they wanted to claim Palestine we'll get to shortly. The Zionists knew they had to invent a long history rather than a recent new nation, a problem encountered by all imagined communities. The problem was this: how to reject and deny the ghetto Jew, that despicable stereotype of the anti-Semites, yet claim Jewish historical continuity with Palestine. The solution was nothing short of ingenious. Zionism rejected the old diasporic Jew while embracing the mythical biblical Jew, selecting a gallery of military leaders of past revolts against the Hellenic and Roman empires. They invented an unambiguous trait of Jewish militarism, building an ideological foundation for the new army destined to become the state's central institution. The Jew became the imagined heir of Joshua, Bar Kokhba, Judah, Maccabee. This is from a book called The Zionist Ideology by Gideon Shimoni. This chapter is called Zionism as a Secular Jewish Identity. They wanted to erase the old Jew and create a new one. They favored religious traditions insofar as these could be pressed into the service of militant nationalism. They stridently extolled whatever strange of national assertiveness they could select out of the religion in Jewish history, and contemptuously rejected whatever smacked of abstract spirituality and political passivity. In their eyes, the Bible was the main repository of the positive elements, whereas theological spirituality and passivity were the unfortunate legacy of the Talmud and later rabbinic literature. They erased what makes Judaism Judaism, the Talmud. You know, the irony of ironies is that there are people who look at the Zionists or Israel as organically Jewish, as the Zionism, as the national movement of the Jewish people. And they look at the conflict between the Zionists and the Palestinians as, okay, so the Jews have a connection to this homeland, and this is the Jews returning home. The only question is, how do you balance the Jewish aspirations and connections versus the Palestinians' rights and their connections? The truth is that the Zionists do not represent the Jews at all. And the funny thing is that you have groups of people. It started with the anti-Semites a long time ago, but now even people who are influenced by them, even innocently, that say, okay, well, these Zionists, let's look into Judaism and see what there is in Judaism that can explain what the Zionists are doing. Let's look particularly into the Talmud. They don't want to look into the Bible because the Bible is shared by the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims. They want to identify what they see the Zionists as doing with something exclusively Jewish, which is the Talmud. And the truth is just the opposite. It's the Talmud that says the Jews are not allowed to have sovereignty before the Messiah comes. It's the Talmud that says Jews are not allowed to fight wars nowadays. It's the Talmud that's this whole pacifist ideology that I'm describing to you is all from the Talmud. And as I explained, it takes the Bible and it interprets it in our Jewish way. And all the scholars, everybody in the world knows that the Zionists just rejected it all. The Zionists don't quote the Talmud. They don't follow it. They just invented their own Zionism. And what they did was they took whatever religion was good for them, because religion requires discipline. Religion requires obedience. Nationalism requires those same things. Fascism especially requires those things. So if they could take the Jewish religion, transform it into something new. There are different transformations that people did to Judaism. There's the Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism. Christianity believes they're a fulfillment of Judaism, and the Jews say that no, that's another deviant version of Judaism. It was once upon a time, now it became a new religion. Zionism is just another one of these reformations of Judaism. They took what they wanted out of the Bible, I can't even say out of Judaism, stripped it of whatever they wanted, and now they said, we are the real Jews. And that's what makes Zionism different than all other Jewish reform movements. Because all the other Jewish reform movements said, no, you know what, we're right, the Orthodox Jews are wrong. They have the wrong interpretation. The Zionists said, no, we're a political nation. And we are the representatives of all the Jews. And irony of ironies, people looking at them and say, well, look, in the Talmud it says this or that, and that must be what's influencing the Zionists, when it's literally the opposite. Literally the opposite. They stripped the Talmud, and now these anti-Semitic quotes, misquotes from the Talmud are now it's such a disaster. People don't understand what the Zionists did and what they are. The Zionists used this trauma to create a culture and a nationality and a people that are just the opposite of Jews. The reason why they wanted Palestine is because, you want to hear irony of ironies? There were various different groups of non-Zionist Jews and Zionist Jews. And the non-Zionist Jews, take me for example, my people said, we want nothing to do with these guys. We don't want no state, we're not having a state. There were Jews, just as there is in Christianity, Christians that are various denominations. There's the Catholics, there's the Protestants. Zionism is a different denomination of Judaism. Coming to Jews and asking them, well, how do you explain what the Zionists are doing, is like going to the Pope and asking him, how do you explain what the evangelicals are doing? They're Christians. Right. The Pope will say, well, hold on. They're Protestants. I'm Catholic. And somebody who doesn't know the difference, say, you both believe in Jesus? You both believe in the New Testament? You both believe in the Trinity? Come on, what difference is it? No, we're two completely different religions. The Zionists are their own religion. Now, what happened was that the Zionists created this nationalist and the Jabotinsky version fascist. The Ben-Gurion version was more socialist. But again, I want to talk about the Jabotinsky version now. This more fascist, militant, but the trauma is the thing. He said, he tried to make these Jewish youth proud to give their lives for something. Gaon, v'achzor, proud and cruel. There was another one of the Beitar anthems that said that sung about how Jews Im Eved im Helech notzarto ben Melech, whether you're a slave or a tramp, you were created a prince with King David's crown on your head. And in the flames of rebellion, just remember the inner glory that you have. Things like that we're going to redeem the whole Jewish history. That's also why they needed Judaism. Because just to say, okay, we're going to be a bunch of rebels, that's not a big deal. We are the redeemers. We are the final fulfillment. We are finally going to be the heroes of all of Jewish history. The ancient Jews, the biblical Jews, they always wanted to be us, but they couldn't. They were downtrodden. They were scared. They were weak. They were all the things that Jabotinsky described people like me as. Now we're not going to be that anymore. This is a powerful myth to give youth. And he created this trauma. There was a Newsweek journalist, Stuart Alsop, who once told Golda Meir that the reason why she can't negotiate, why they can't make peace with their enemies, he's told her, you have a Masada complex. She said to him, you say we have a Masada complex? Yes, and we have a pogrom complex and a Holocaust complex. And this trauma is channeled by Zionist leaders into this fierceness, and this is not going to happen again. And normally trauma is these complexes that Golda Meir is talking about. Normal people consider complexes baggage that they try to get rid of. People go to therapy to get rid of these things. But the Zionists, this is not only is it their motivating factor, their driving factor, but it's their actual identities. We discussed last time the anti-Semitism. That's really what makes them Jews. And you have people for generations who have been going through this, and now, and then there was the Holocaust, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. If you needed any straws, it wasn't a straw. This nuclear weapon that just completely obliterated the camel's back and the rest of the camel and the whole desert with him. And now you have, look what happens because we weren't Zionists. Look what happens because you were the old Jews. They took this, they created a cause and effect myth here. That yes, if we would have had Israel, if we would have been Zionists, if we would have been proud and cruel, Holocaust never would have happened. If we would have had a state, Holocaust never would have happened. So it's a binary choice. Either be Zionists or be in Auschwitz. One of the two. And the rest of the world? There's another song. It was a pretty popular song in Israel years ago. It's called Ha'olam Kulo Negdenu. The whole world is against us. And they were singing about how the whole world is against us. The words go, the whole world is against us. This is an old song. They don't care about us, and they never did. And the song ends, they can all go to hell. That's a quote. And we don't care about them either. That's what we don't care about them either. They can all go to hell. So they have this defense mechanism that where was the whole world during the Holocaust? The whole world tells us to do something. Well, where were you when we were being shoved into concentration camps? Where were you? You didn't let us in. You didn't care about us. You told us, Jews, you're on your own. Now we're on our own. Fine, we're on our own. Don't come back now and tell us what to do. Israel, now the truth of the matter is we know that there are books written that the Zionists actually sabotaged rescue efforts for Jews if the final destination of the Jew in danger was not Palestine. Because they wanted to make sure that the Jews needed that Palestine. So in Zionist ideologies, people think that Zionist ideology in it, the other, quote unquote, is the Arab or the Palestinian. It's not true. The Palestinian, the Arab, they just got in the way. There's nothing inherent in Zionist ideology that has anything against Palestinians. Nothing inherent. Had Palestine been a land without a people, everything would be fine. The other, quote unquote, in Zionist ideology is the old-time Orthodox Jew. They are trying not to be us. We are the other. They need us, though, because they need to be able to steal the identity of Jewishness, kind of like a parasite that can't kill its host. So they can't just disavow or denounce. They could say the Haredim, what do they say about them? These guys don't want to join the army. They're lazy. They don't want to serve their country. None of this is true. We don't want to be Zionists. And with our last breath, we will resist. Just like we resisted the Syrian Greeks on Hanukkah, we're going to resist the Zionist attempt to get us to be Zionists. And part of that is going into the indoctrination camp of the Zionist army, which is an indoctrination camp for Zionism. So the Zionists, really, to talk to them, you need to get through this trauma. Right now, the Zionists believe, because this trauma was channeled And traumatized people will believe various different things, even if they're not true. For example, this absurd, insane idea that Israel is the only safe place for Jews in the world. That's crazy. Israel is the least safest place for Jews anywhere in the world that Jews live. We're much safer here. We're much safer in Australia and Canada. Mathematically, the odds of you getting killed because you're a Jew in Israel is astronomically greater than anywhere else in the entire world. So now, if you tell this to Zionists, you get various different answers. So some Zionists have said, you know what? At least we're going down fighting. Yes, but at least we'll go down fighting. At least we have our manhood. At least we have our courage. We'd rather go down fighting than live like you in America. Or the anti-Semites, yes, we can't stop anti-Semitism, but at least we can tell them where to go. Okay? There's no utility to Israel. It became like a traumatized person who hits back and is irrational. Step one, if you want to get through to Zionists, is to explain to them that Israel, which they hold on to like a life preserver, because they're convinced they're like in the middle of a tsunami with this little life preserver, Israel, everybody trying to drown them, that this is not a life preserver, it's a cement overcoat. Okay, that making peace is much better than making war. You need to convince Zionists that this whole idea of Zionism is not a Jewish movement. This is not organically Jewish things that you're doing. The Zionists created this whole myth. Now, it became a kind of a vicious cycle, because now there were religious Jews that, because they believed, like people once did, that once Zionism gets off the ground, the Jews will have a safe place to go. Herzl wrote in his book, anti-Semitism will disappear. Okay, so we're not Zionists. Zionists are heretics. They're anti-Jewish. They're really the enemies of God and the Torah. But you know what? Let's use their idea. They're at least going to find us a safe place. At least we'll be protected. And ironically, the Orthodox Jews that went along with the idea, again, my people said, no, we're not allowed by our religious law to go along with the idea. Also, it's a bad idea. There were many who foresaw just endless wars with this Zionism business. There were others that said, you know what? No, the Zionists claim they can get us a safe place, fine. But when these Orthodox Jews, the religious Zionists in those days, when they, against another denomination, when they came to the vote to take the Uganda plan, many of these Orthodox Jews said, let's take Uganda. We don't care about Palestine. All we want is a safe place. See, ironically, the Zionists had this ideology that they had to fulfill, this Jewish identity that they had to create. And the reason they wanted Palestine was because you can't be a nationality without a nation. Well, you can. You have the Kurds. But imagine how important it would be for this to transform the Jews, for this transformation project, if they could actually get back the ancient Jewish residents. I'm not saying homeland, because we discussed last time that's not how we look at it. It's a holy land, not a homeland. Imagine the return home. We'll transform that into a homeland. We'll transform that into a political thing too. But the religious Jews who went along with the Zionists, and they were wrong for doing so, they said, okay, at least we'll have a safe place, so let's take Uganda. The non-religious wanted Palestine because that enabled them, that helped them to create this whole transformation of the Jew into the politician. One more step to today's Israeli government. So you have these traumatized, blood, fire, revenge, achzori, cruel, proud, and generous to each other. Yes, that is part of what they said. people who would to die or conquer the mountain type youth that grew up. They had their own children. Now they grew up and they believed that this is what it means to be Jewish, because that was part of the mythology. They invented that history. And now there was a religious Jew. His name was Rabbi Kook, that liked this philosophy. He liked nationalism, the secular nationalism, Hegelian nationalism, Bergson, all these nationalists, even Spinoza. So what he did was he superimposed nationalism onto Judaism. He said that all this nationalist stuff, he didn't even say it's nationalist stuff. He took it, regurgitated it in rabbinic, even mystical language, and presented it as Judaism in a mystical way. The more mystical it is, the less the average person can figure out what it means. This mystical type Judaism, and the non-religious Jews loved him, and he loved them too. He created a whole group of people. Today they're the settlers, and they also went through metamorphosis, that have nationalism as part of their Judaism. Now, the thing is that just like that Rabbi Kook, he created a monster. He was actually a pacifist. And he, you know what, let me read you something about this too, okay? Now, Rabbi Kook was considered a heretic and idol worshiper by the greatest Jewish rabbis. A lot of people didn't know really about his nationalistic, idolatrous tendencies. He hid them. His people, a lot of his people now, when they reprint his stuff, his books, they censor it. Okay. Because they want him to be looked at as a regular Orthodox rabbi. And he himself wanted himself to be looked at a regular Orthodox rabbi. So he tried to show and he was very Orthodox, very scholarly, and he showed that part of himself, that dimension of himself, to the Orthodox. And he said, what do these zealots want from me? Then he went to the non-religious and showed them his nationalist Zionist part and said, I'm one of you guys. The thing is, he was a pacifist and a closest thing you're going to get to a humanist. Mm-hmm. But because his ideology was not logical or coherent, it was just a hodgepodge of nationalism mixed with Judaism. So his son, the Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, he took his father's methodology and his father's nationalist connection to the land, as opposed to the Jewish connection to the land, which is a religious one, and mixed it with the militancy of some of the other strains of nationalism, and created the parent ideology of all of the settlers today. And we'll get to how the settlers became settlers in a moment. This is a book called Civil Religion in Israel, Charles Liebman and Eliezer Dan Yechia, two academics in Israel. I really like the book. It describes how Israel is, on one hand, Zionism is a completely secular movement, and yet it seems to mimic Judaism. According to Rav Kook, as Rav is rabbi in Hebrew, the Jewish nation had a mission to assist in the redemption of all humanity, but his universalist thrust is neglected by Rav Tzvi Yehuda. The Son lays greater emphasis on the great gulf separating Jews and Gentiles. The older Rabbi Kook even was like favorable for a practitioner of the Jewish religion. He was very favorable to Jesus and Jesus's doctrine. But the Son lays greater emphasis on the great gulf separating Jews and Gentiles. The Holocaust demonstrates the iniquity of the Gentiles and their enmity to the Jews. One cannot trust the Gentiles, nor is there any need to consider their opinions. the Jewish nation must act in accordance with its own interests, relying only on its own powers and its trust in God. A leader of Gush Emunim, that was the settler, the Cook organization movement, compared himself to the militantly anti-religious writer Yosef Chaim Brenner in his deep attachment to the land of Israel. Brenner hated Judaism. He made the most anti-Semitic comments about the Jews. But the leader of the Gush Emunim, who was himself an Orthodox Jew, compared himself to Brenner, the common denominator being their connection to the land. He coupled such molders of the rabbinic tradition as Rabbi Akiva and the Ramban, that's Nachmanides, together with the founders of modern Jewish settlements. Quote, "This is all one thing for me, a very, very simple feeling," end quote. Another Gush Emunim spokesman noted that in many respects, the new settlements were a continuation of the efforts of the second and third Aliyot, the people that immigrated to Israel, even though these earlier settlers were not conscious of faith and sanctity at all. So you have all 2,000 years of our exile. Rabbi Yehuda Amital, founder of one of the major religious Zionist schools, spoke of Israel's war as a biblical phenomenon. Quote, "All 2,000 years of our exile, we didn't know war. We knew many terrible troubles. In exile, there is no war." End quote. The Yom Kippur War had a messianic dimension because it was a consequence of, quote, "the establishment of the kingdom of Israel." The war was not only between the state of Israel and the Arab states, but a confrontation between the Jewish nation and the nations of the world, in which the anger of the Gentiles at the establishment of Jewish sovereignty brought them to, quote, "fight for their very existence as Gentiles." It started off with guys like Herzl, who had an idea to convert all Jews to Christianity to end anti-Semitism. So he invented this secular, he didn't invent it, but he was the operations manager, you could say, for this secular Zionism. They added a bunch of Jewish symbols and made this civic religion. There were Orthodox Jews that wrongly, sinfully joined with them, but their motivation was just utilitarian, just utility, safety. They wanted safety. Then you had Rabbi Cook that blended everything together and said, okay, not only can we or should we join with the Zionists, but this is really Judaism. And then you had his son that added the militant dimension to it. And then you have these settlers. What they're doing is they're following I have no way to describe their ideology. It's a freewheeling Marx Brothers type Judaism that really has no rhyme or reason except the most militant type of Jabotinsky, revisionist, Beitar youth, blood and fire Zionism. And even Jabotinsky created a monster as well. It wasn't only Rabbi Cook. Menachem Begin was a very close student of Jabotinsky. He named his son after Jabotinsky as soon as he was born. He called Jabotinsky's widow and told him he named his son after him. Jabotinsky scolded Begin for being too militant. Jabotinsky had this motto that they're going to fight for self-defense, and Begin changed the motto of the group to "we're going to fight to conquer the homeland." So you have all these denominations, everybody calling themselves Judaism. You have the Messianic Jews calling themselves Judaism, and you have Jews for Jesus. And I say these are just Jews for Zionism. It's a completely different denomination. Coming to someone like me and comparing me to the Zionists is like going to the Pope and comparing him to the evangelicals because they're both Christians. The distance between the Pope and the evangelicals, between the Catholic Church and the evangelicals, is not nearly as great as traditional Orthodox Jews and Zionist Orthodox Jews. Netanyahu considers himself, he said, a student of Jabotinsky. Netanyahu's father was a protege of Jabotinsky. He was one of Jabotinsky's closest students. So you have the religious Zionists, the Menachem Begins, the Netanyahu, who got together with these settlers. these conquer the land settlers who we saw the description, and that's what you have today in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I want to ask about whether events since October 7th, Israeli violence particularly, whether that's a direct consequence of the overcompensation that we're talking about, or is that too much of an overstatement, or are we beyond that now?
I have no doubt that the Zionist decisions about when to go to war, when not to go to war, and they say so themselves. I'm not saying anything secret. I'm not saying anything that's not well known. That part of the consideration is, okay, where were you during the Holocaust? Never again. This will not happen again. You hear Zionists saying this all the time. Where was the whole world? They're all silent. Or this trauma that Golda Meir admitted that Zionists have is certainly part of their decision. Now, the Zionists will tell you that this is correct, that we need Israel. We have what did Golda Meir say? We have nowhere else to go. These Zionists live in a world where they're not fighting for the state of Israel. They're fighting for the redemption of all the Jews throughout history. Netanyahu said last time he came to America, not last time he came to America, but when he came to America during Barack Obama's presidency to talk to Congress, to convince them to oppose Barack Obama's Iran deal, he said before he left that I represent not only the people who voted for me, but I represent all the Jews all over the world. They believe, all this belief that there's another Holocaust. How many times have you heard that America, from Zionists, America or Europe is like Germany in the 1930s? I've heard this for 50 years. It's like Germany in the 1930s. We're just stuck in the 1930s. Yes, everybody who opposes Israel are anti-Semites. Anybody who opposes Zionism are anti-Semites. Anti-Semites are everywhere. Hitler is everywhere. Nazis are everywhere. And anybody that opposes the Zionist ideology, because in their minds, it's such a beautiful, romantic story. Their narrative, the Jews downtrodden, they finally pick themselves up, and these weak, oppressed people got back their 2,000-year-old homeland. They got a land without a people for a people without a land. They got it back. And they have an army now. Jews who not long ago, 1948, Israel was founded. In 1945, World War II ended. So just a few years ago, Jews were being carted off to concentration camps. And now we have our own country. Never again will that happen to us. Now we're normalized. Now we're part of the family of nations. Such a beautiful, and who wants to disrupt that? Terrorists. They're the only people that want to disrupt it. Anybody wants to disrupt that, challenge that, wants the Jews to be defenseless. And they want the Jews to go back to the concentration camps, because even today they study Jewish history. Jewish history is not Jewish history, it's the history of Zionism, because the final chapter in Jewish history in Zionist lessons is Israel. And Holocaust studies is not Holocaust studies, it's Zionism studies, because the final chapter in all Holocaust studies is Israel. Kids go to Auschwitz and they come out crying after they get the tour, draping with an Israeli flag draped over their shoulders. Imagine you talk about the trauma. Let's take the African American community. They were oppressed. They were dragged here from Africa in chains to be slaves. Then they were freed. Imagine if they would react to their oppression by bringing African-American children down south to visit the sites of lynchings, stick their heads in the nooses, let them feel it, show videos, make them feel they're part of it, and say, the white people, they'll never do this to us again, never again. We're going to get our own country that'll represent all the black people. It's our only hope. It's either nationalism or lynchings. And could you imagine what type of trauma that would create? This is trauma on top of trauma for generations and generations. I have no doubt that Israel's decisions about what they consider security. I disagree with them so often, but I can also, to a large extent, it's not only me, anybody who understands the history of Zionism and the ideology of it could pretty much predict what they would say. When the UN voted in Obama's days that the settlements were illegal and America vetoed it, or America abstains then. It was Obama, America abstained. Netanyahu made a statement then that people really didn't understand. Netanyahu was, he didn't care what the UN said. He said, I don't care. And when they told him that he's starting another war, he's not being reasonable, he said something like this. He said, we're Jews, we don't turn the other cheek. The nations of the world don't respect people that bend their knees. They don't respect obsequious people. We're going to show them that we're a healthy nation. All this weird talk. Healthy nation. We don't turn the other cheek. The idea of Zionism is the Jews were not healthy people. They were sick. Now they're healthy. And it's just a bunch of anti-Semites that oppose Zionism. They're trained to be like this, trained through trauma, trained through the schools, trained through the army. People think mistakenly that the way to end this conflict in the Middle East is, they think that Zionism means colonialism, the colonizing, and this is Jabotinsky's, where the Zionists themselves said, was just a result of Zionism. That's colonialism is itself an ideology. For the Zionists, colonialism was not the ideology. It was the action. Zionism was the ideology that made them take this land. And Zionism is this idea that this fake Jewish, this mythological Jewish history, this mythological interpretation of Jewish danger, the danger Jews are in, and what brings Jews security. And even though it's mathematical, Israel is dangerous for Jews, they still claim that it's the safest place for Jews. President Biden not long ago said Jews in America would not be safe if not for Israel. The truth is, Israel puts us all in much more danger, there's no question. But the fact that they could see the world in with such a hallucination is a result of their education, their being traumatized, their overcompensation for their shame, their trauma, their being rejected, their suffering. And the Jews did suffer, there's no question about it. But to react this way, an overcompensation, even if I wasn't a religious Jew, from the religious Jewish perspective, they're opposed to me. But even if I wasn't a religious Jew, if I was just a therapist, I would tell them, this is not going to help you. You want to be normal, don't try to overcompensate. Don't do that. I can't imagine the effect of these songs, this training on Jabotinsky's Beitar youth. Now these are the great-grandchildren of those youth today.
Well, in effect, were they training them to embrace cruelty as a virtue?
Self-defense is a virtue.
Right.
And cruelty is a way to ensure that you kill the enemy when mercy is not called for. Yeah. And the only question is, the problem is for Zionists, this trauma isn't merely something that results in certain controversial self-defense tactics. This is their Jewish identity. Theodor Herzl said, the anti-Semite makes the Jew. We are one people, distress holds us together. They asked him, I mentioned this last time, how many times have you heard that when you want to define who a Jew is, we have the religion, the Torah, that tells us who's a Jew. To the Zionists, What I mean, Hitler didn't distinguish between religious and non-religious. If Hitler said you're a Jew, we're going to make you a Jew. Hitler becomes can you imagine, never mind that I can't think of anything quite more anti-Semitic than making Hitler the one who decides who and what a Jew is. But aside from that, can you imagine the effect it has on a person? That your identity as a Jew is determined by a guy like Adolf Hitler. And what the Zionists want to do is it's a continuation of what they're doing today, is a continuation of the identity theft of them taking over Jewish identity. Have here an article by Stephen Bain. He's one of the big Zionist, you call them thought leaders, right? From the journal called Jewish Political Studies Review, spring 2008. The title is American Jewry in the State of Israel, How Intense the Bonds of Peoplehood. Now the truth is there is no bonds of peoplehood. American Jewry are Americans. The State of Israel is a foreign country. But the Zionists remember Zionism means Jews are a nationality and Israel is their state. Mm-hmm. Here's what he says. First, he talks about the Birthright Israel program. The Birthright Israel program articulated both the centrality of Israel to American Jewish identity, and Israel's responsibility to preserve Jewish continuity in North America. Israel really harms Jewish continuity in North America because it changes the definition of being a Jew. But listen to this. Lastly, Jews and Americans alike need to understand the centrality of Israel to the identification of Jews as Jews and with the broader Jewish people. Given both the place of Zion in Jewish history and thought and the transformation in the Jewish tradition wrought by Zionism, the American Jewish-Israeli relationship cannot rest solely on strategic interests or even, for that matter, shared values. Instead, the relationship rests on being a Jew and being part of the Jewish people in the 21st century. In that sense, denying the Jews the opportunity to support Israel is to deny them the opportunity to be themselves. All of this is put together. Zionism means that the Jews are a nationality, not just a religion. The way they convince the Jews to buy into that is through this fear-mongering and the traumatizing and all of this education, this diseducation, and through supporting Israel. There are two reasons why somebody supports Israel among those that do. Either because it's ideological, they're Zionists, or even if they're not Zionists. There are many people that support Israel because they believe the narrative that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and they spread democracy and they share Western values, and the Palestinians are a bunch of savage terrorists. And if you believe that narrative, then you're going to support Israel, even if you're not a Zionist. And then when they tell you there are so many Jews who are Zionists, you'll say it's not true. They'll say, well, look how many Jews support Israel. Well, what do you mean support Israel? If supporting Israel means you don't want Israel to be bombed, then I support Israel. I don't want any harm to come to any Jews in Israel. I think Zionism is the biggest danger to the Jews in Israel. It's not good for them at all. It's danger for the Jews in America. But so they use these words, supporting Israel, Zionism, in ambiguous ways, and they manipulate people's minds and they manipulate the public, and people are so distracted, they're so distant from the real issue, from what Zionism really is, from understanding what's really going on over there.
Mm-hmm. It's not self-defense then when they say it's self-defense? Obviously, it's cruelty of a certain kind. And I'm just wondering, how far is it going to go? Or do they want it to go?
The part of being against Zionism, part of being a Jewish Jew as opposed to a Zionist Jew, is to understand that Israel has as much connection to me as China or Korea does. You asking me that question, I'll give you my opinion, but you asking me that question is like asking me what I think Putin's going to do in Ukraine or Zelensky's going to do. Based on what I know about Zionism, based on what the Zionists themselves say, I'm not saying what part is self-defense, what part is not self-defense. When you say it, that pronoun, when you said it's not self-defense, you have to define what the it is. Otherwise, it becomes a universal, holistic statement, and that oversimplifies matters very, very much. Look, we already have rulings from international court. So you're asking me to rule on something that the international court already ruled on, and that's the ICJ. The ICC is in the middle of their ruling. This is in court. This is a court case. We know what it is. Israel, the Zionists, even if they could make peace, they have other considerations that to them are greater than lives. They would sacrifice Jewish lives, never mind Palestinians. They would sacrifice Jewish lives for the ideology of Zionism. Remember, they believe better to go down fighting than to live like an exiled Jew. So if they look at themselves as, okay, these people want us to go back to being weak, being defenseless, these people want us to become exiled Jews. I'd rather die. I'd rather go down fighting. That's what we need to address. It's the Zionist ideology that needs to be fought. What the Zionists are doing, I guarantee you, there's 10 different Zionists, I'll give you 10 different stories. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, these guys, they're talking about conquering Greater Israel. There are others that say all Palestinians are terrorists. There are others there are all sorts of different people with opinions going on over there. Zionists are not monolithic. They're not. To Ben Gvir and Smotrich, it makes no difference if the Palestinians are terrorists. They don't care. They believe in that Israel belongs to the Jews, and there are plenty of Zionists that'll tell you this. Israel belongs to the Jews, and that's it. Gaza belongs to the Jews. And their goal is sovereignty in Gaza. There are others that believe, well, all Gazans are terrorists. So they don't really care about sovereignty over Gaza, they just care about getting rid of the terrorists, which in their mind are all these people. The common denominator, the first cause of all of these opinions and ideologies is that one thing called Zionism. Zionism started with the idea that the Jews are a nationality and Israel is its state. In order to support that idea, they created this traumatic mythological history of the Jews, right? And I don't mean to deny any of the Jewish suffering. What I mean is to deny the proper response to that suffering in their mind. That then you had the religious Zionists, that denomination, the nationalism. Then you had the overcompensation. You have all of these things, and you can smack one head, and it's like playing whack-a-mole. You smack one, and another 10 will pop up. Zionism today is not the same as it was in the 1950s. In the 1950s, Jacob Blaustein wrote a letter to Ben-Gurion, how dare you claim that you are the state of all the Jews? How dare you claim to represent the Jews? How dare you ask Jews in America to move to Israel? How dare you? And Ben-Gurion gave in. He said, we would never do such a thing. Of course, that was a lie. Zionism changes, and Zionists know it changes. I could show you in Zionist books. They say we change our story as needed. The leftist Zionists and the Ben-Gvir and Smotrich Zionists barely look at each other as the same religion or the same people. The common denominator that needs to be attacked, that can be attacked, is the basic Zionist idea. That, one, basic Zionist ideas. Israel is the nation state of all Jews, as opposed to the state of its citizens. Israel represents a safe place for the Jews. Worse yet, it's the only hope for safety for the Jews. Once these things are over, once these myths are busted, Zionists will become a lot more normal, because they will lose a lot of the motivation for whatever it is that they feel that they're doing. The religious Zionists will still be religious Zionists, but honestly, they could be marginalized, those guys, the settler guys.
So, I mean, any insight into how we can create this sort of discourse in the public domain?
Absolutely. As much as possible, we need to separate Israel from the Jewish people. The Jewish people are a group of people. They're all over the world. They share a common religion. The non-religious ones, you know what? Ask them what their Jewishness is. Whatever that, bagels and lox, Woody Allen, doesn't make sense to me, but whatever it is, it is. Israel is a foreign country. It's the country of the Israelis. It has nothing to do with world Jewry. This identity thing, that has to go. The more you get closer to that, the more you get to include, the closer you get to including all human beings from the river to the sea in one peaceful state. The more you say, this country was given to the Jews by the UN, which it wasn't. It was given to the Jews. It was promised to the Jews by God, which also, according to Judaism, that's not the proper interpretation. It wasn't promised to Netanyahu, believe me. Once you get rid of the idea that these Zionists must desperately own that, because the Arabs have 25, 28 countries to go to, we have nowhere to go. If we leave Israel, we'll all be slaughtered. Once you get rid of all of that, and you make Israel into a normal country, the country of the Israelis, not the country of the Jews, the more you remove the Jewish need and the Jewish desire to have that sovereignty of that country, the more closer you get to having a country of all its people. It's an ideological war. The problem is people don't want to fight it. I've spoken to so many people. They say, why should I get involved in internal conflict amongst the Jews? That's what the Zionists want you to say. That gives the Zionists license to say they represent all Jews. If a member of one of the Arab countries or the Muslim countries, right? If the Prince of Saudi Arabia would say, I represent all the Muslims all over the world, people would question him. People should question Netanyahu. How did you become the state of the Jews? What does that even mean? Jew, you ask a Jew, do you believe America's your country or do you believe Israel's your country? The Israeli court said a person can only have one nationality. Is your nationality Jewish or is your nationality American? And if your nationality you say is Jewish, then what's your country? Zionism is intellectually absurd. It's logically incoherent, and it needs to be exposed for that. These Zionists think there are two things. There's the ideology of Zionism for ideological reasons. They will sacrifice things, sacrifice Jews because at least we'll go down fighting. They need to be taught that that is a absurd, destructive, suicidal, and above all, unnecessary ideology. You don't want to go down fighting. You don't. You want to live. The shame that you were taught to feel was induced into you by Zionists on purpose. So you should have this fierce reaction. They need therapy. They need to be taught that what they were taught was false, that they were brainwashed, that they don't need Israel. Israel is a liability to the Jewish people. Israel being a Jewish state is a liability to the Jewish people. Will they ever believe this?
Sounds like deprogramming.
Deprogramming, yes, they need deprogramming. They need deprogramming, that's it. The problem is that most non-Jewish people who need to get involved in this come back and say, okay, well, you know what, I'm just a person. I need to obtain all this knowledge, and then I need to talk to people. I need an audience, and what am I talking about Jews? Who's really a Jew? And the Zionists bank on that. But the truth is, this has nothing to do with that. This is history. This is history of the Middle East, history of the Zionist movement. This is Zionist ideology, this simple logic and philosophy, and simple safety. If anybody cares about Jews, we should convince them that it's not a good idea to go down fighting. I live here in the United States of America. I don't run into bomb shelters when the siren goes off. I'm not evacuated from the south of Queens into the north of Queens, or from the north of Queens to the south of Queens because of rockets. Those guys are, and they think they're safe. You want to know what to do about that? You want to know what to do about people who are constantly in mortal danger, that think that they're the only safe place in the world? That's what needs to be done. They need to be deprogrammed. Once they realize that what they're fighting for is not worth it, what they're fighting for is unnecessary. What they're fighting for is, you don't need to fight for it.
Sort of a letting go of a certain kind. This has been such a profoundly illuminating and nuanced discussion. Rabbi Shapiro, I'm just wondering, before we wrap up, if you have any final thoughts and observations.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think that a very big obstacle to progress in this area is the fact that, let's say from October 7th till today, the entire discourse has been based on entertainment media. These debates that people have on talk shows, these social media posts, these discussions, it's all based on what can provide the best entertainment value and the most views and the best advertising value. And that, unfortunately, leads people to believe that what they're hearing is serious discourse and serious information, but it's not. We were talking before, the reason why the discourses or the so-called debates are so violent, right? Verbally violent, is because gladiatorial combat is illegal in this country. So this is just another form of a boxing match. This is intellectual verbal boxing. That's all it is. And people are glued to the computer because they receive the same entertainment value that they do from a boxing match or from a gladiatorial combat. And they're sitting there and they're going like this when the other guy talks, or like this. And people are just not getting educated, and they're really just getting diseducated. Instead, what people should be doing is go to the academic scholarly works. Ignore the videos, ignore the debates, ignore the television, ignore all of that, because de-education. I don't know if there is such a word. If not, now there is. Diseducation.
Right.
Okay? They're being de-educated and they're getting diseducation. Go to the history. Go to the ideology of Zionism. There are plenty of good books out there. I'm not going to plug my own. I don't really mean to do that. There are plenty of good books out there.
Right.
My book I wrote mostly for Orthodox Jews anyway. There are plenty of good books out there that people could read. If you seriously care about what's going on and you're seriously interested in a solution, then entertainment media, and that's all of this stuff is not really helpful.
Point well taken. Thank you so much, Rabbi Shapiro, once again.
Thank you for having me again.
Thank you.